When we start exploring the science behind brain development, a really great place to start is something called a brain cell, otherwise known as a neuron. I'd like you to take a guess as to how many neurons that you believe a human infant is born with. A human infant is born with around 100 billion neurons. Did you get that right? Now, although we are born with many neurons, the important thing to note here is that what is still developing are neural pathways. Now, let's take a closer look at a neuron to be able to understand how a pathway works. On your screen, you will see a very simple illustration of a neuron. Now, when we're looking at the way in which neural pathways are formed, two great parts of the neuron to look at are the dendrites and the axons. Now, the dendrites are the branch-like formations that receive information into the cell, and the axons are the cable-like formations that transmit information away from the cell. An axon will connect to a dendrite through a neural junction, also known as a synapse. When new information is received by a neuron, they will transmit an electrical pulse through these synaptic connections. Neurons are often referred to as the basic building blocks of the brain. We are born with everything that we need for optimal development and learning about our world. It is through the connection of the axon to the dendrite, through the synapse, that a pathway is formed. Every time that we experience something new, a new pathway is formed. Every time that that experience is repeated, the pathway becomes thicker and stronger, until our response becomes automatic and it is learned. During a time of learning, a pathway is formed, strengthened, and refined. There are over 120 different parts of the brain that are involved in multiple complex processes that help us to engage with our world around us. However, when we're talking about early brain development, it's really helpful to organise the brain into four main areas. This is the brainstem, the cerebellum, the limbic system, and the neocortex. Let's have a look at each of these different parts and what they're involved in. The brainstem is in charge of all of our automatic survival functioning. All of the things that we don't need to think about that keep us alive, such as our heartbeat and our breathing. The cerebellum is the movement centre of the brain, so that helps with all of our fine and our gross motor skills and also our balance perception. When we move up to the limbic system, we can break that into three main parts. That is the diencephalon, which helps us to process the sensory input within our environment, the hippocampus, which helps us to process our memories, and the amygdala. You may have heard of the amygdala as being the guard dog or the superhero of the brain. This helps us to perceive threat and danger within our environment and triggers the fight, flight, freeze response. It is also believed that the amygdala holds a lot of our really big emotions. When we move up into the neocortex, this is the part that helps us to be able to think and engage. It has our cerebrum, which helps us to process and speak, and also our prefrontal cortex, which is involved in a lot of our higher functioning processes, such as problem solving, planning, and modulating some of those really big emotions that we can have. Neural circuits, also known as the wiring of the brain, are formed very early on into life. It's also important to note that our brain develops and wires from the bottom to the top, which means that the first to wire is our brainstem and our cerebellum, which can often be referred to as our survival brain. The next to wire is our limbic system or our emotional brain, and the last to wire is our thinking brain or our neocortex. It's also important to note that in behind our forehead, where our prefrontal cortex sits, actually doesn't completely develop until the ages between 22 and 30. Now that's really important to remember when we're thinking about being able to modulate our emotional responses and our behaviours. Now, the way in which information comes through our brain is also the same way that it forms. So when we receive information from our external or our internal stimuli, it actually is processed from the bottom to the top. So it's really important to remember that our lower parts of our brain need to process information before it comes to our thinking brain. Therefore, it's incredibly important to have a strong foundation and strong neural circuits in the lower part of our brains, and this is important right from birth. In our next video, we're going to be having a look at the brain from birth and also gaining that understanding as to how to create and form a solid foundation of neural circuitry right from birth through our attachments and our relationships.